Hi, and welcome. This is just going to be kind of a ramble on, I don't know, geopolitics, I guess, colonialism, and for most of you, watch all three of you, most of the two of the three of you, probably all three of you will find this just kind of banal and boring and gibberish, and that's fine. It's meant to be. It's supposed to make you relaxed and calm. And if you learn something about geopolitics, that's fun as well. Now, there's something interesting, especially in this game. This, by the way, is Victoria 2. And the whole point of this game is to kind of simulate or model how countries interacted with each other during the colonial expansion, the real colonial expansion of Europe during the 1800s and the 1900s. Where basically, in the course of 100 years, Europe conquered the world. And what it does is it models, I think, quite nicely how it worked. And it's a Paradox game, and they tend to model games quite brutally in that there is no powerful true nation with a guiding light behind it. Nations just interact with each other. So for instance, I'm Sweden, and Sweden throughout history, and lately in particular during this period, was quite technologically advanced but had a very limited population and resources, so it couldn't really expand that far. And this is noticeable in the game because even just getting a few colonies really depletes your resources in this game, and it's quite hard to expand as a country with only 1 million people in it. But if I was playing Great Britain or France or Russia, I could conquer the world, and they did that. And it's interesting how it does this, because all of the different systems play into each other and everyone produces things. So it's modeling the kind of industrialized economic model where people get screwed over and factor things in and play with each other in ways that most games can't really model properly. And this is a very minute audience thing, but it's interesting nonetheless, because there's nothing in particular stopping Madagascar from, in this game at least, becoming a Western nation and conquering the world, except for the fact that it only has 400,000 people, and the people are illiterate, and they don't have any factories. They can't produce things. This limits them, even more than Sweden does. And that limitation is something that often doesn't come up in modern talking about politics. Politicians talk as though things should be done because of morality, or things are done because people believe things, but often it's not even that. It's more just, what can a nation do? And this is kind of the fundamental of it, is what can a nation do and what helps the nation? Because you'll find that no matter what system a government has, it typically tells what's in the interest of its nation. And this is one of the things that the United States is actually an exception in, is that its interests were for other nations to succeed in a very particular way, which is that other nations should be modeled like it. And that was actually the big distinction, particularly after World War II, is a lot of these empires crumbled simply because they couldn't keep up their mercantilist system, because they'd blown all of their money and all their industry on war. And it limited their capabilities quite dramatically, and allowed the United States to essentially dictate what the world did. There's a reason that the president is called the leader of the free world, and it's not because we just love the United States so much. No, it's because the United States has the power. They have the strength, they have the capability to do things, but they don't do them. You'll very rarely see the United States invading Britain for a poor economic policy or that. But because they control the economic and military power of the world, they are able to politely ask. And people are so terrified, so shit scared of what the United States will do, that they do it. And I absolutely love how that is modeled in this game in particular, because if you have enough military and industrial might behind you, you can just threaten people and get what you want. You can just influence them politely and get what you want. And it's interesting in that way. You didn't see it, but I paused for a second there and I had to cut away. Now, what's interesting about this in particular is that this kind of idea about how the world works is that if you view it that way, then it becomes quite difficult to threaten and cajole people and to have this kind of moralist view that people should do the way you do, because you can't force them, you can't influence them. And if you can't do that, then you can't expect them to do what you want. And I find it absolutely interesting and captivating the way nations interact. For instance, Russia's always a good example. Russia, throughout most of history, because of its position and frame point, was kind of limited in where it could go. And you see in this game, Russia is huge. Russia is massive, way bigger than it is today. But that's the borders in the 1800s of Russia. And it didn't diplomatically get those borders. It didn't kindly get those borders. But whatsoever, Russia started as a tiny duchy surrounded by much larger powers, and yet over the years it expanded to this massive empire. And in part it was technologies that helped it expand, but it was also its need, because Russia is on a massive plain with no mountains to defend it. And you'll notice a lot in Europe that a lot of nations form because they can, because it's possible. Because we often forget that Scotland at one point controlled Northumbria, that at one point Ireland was completely independent, that at one point the United Kingdom was many kingdoms. And yet over the years it unified, not because of some connectivity in the British consciousness. Even today, if you talk to British people, they'll tell you, oh, those fucking Welsh, oh, those bloody Cornish bastards. There's still a difference in culture. But because it was a very easily conquerable area and there was no real defensive territory, there were no mountains to stop anyone, eventually it united, not through magic, not through peace, not through harmony, but because someone with power wanted more land, wanted more power, and so they conquered more. And it's interesting in that way that a lot of nations' borders will actually line up perfectly with mountain ranges or geographic lines. And it's only in the modern history, really, like in the last 50, 60 years since World War II, that we've kind of have this idea of a nation without strong borders and without geographic boundaries. There are places throughout history where that has been the case, but you'll notice that those nations tend not to last as long as nations within areas where geographic boundaries are capable. For instance, the country I'm playing now, Sweden, there's a massive mountain range that stretches across the eastern half or the western half of the country. And that's Norway. That's the modern cultural area of Norway. And it's not because the Norwegians just refuse to breed with Swedish people, although they will tell you that Swedish people they would refuse to breed with them. It's because the Norwegians had a massive mountain range to defend against the Swedish influence, and it also made people less likely to move there and a lot less palatable. So in that way, it forced people to kind of move about. And I hope you can't hear it, but there's a dog in the background. I'll try and edit that out. But this is also part of the reason why I haven't been making videos, is because it's quite hard to record. The neighbor's got a new dog, and it's very loud. But I've just kind of given up. So I hope you like the soft sounds of distant barking. Anyway, enough on animals. It's interesting, in a way, how geopolitics is formed because of that. India in particular, that's what I was going for, is a weird place where it had a mountain range separating it, but it could never really unite because of technological limitations. So it essentially formed into several disparate kingdoms that could all constantly conquer each other. And if you look at Indian history, the borders change frequently. It's quite interesting to note that. And also to note in Europe that the places with the most border changes typically happen along the Eurasian plain. So if you look at the map now under all of that, there's this, I'll see if there we go. Austria, France, Switzerland, they form this massive mountain chain that like links up. And then France, Prussia, and all those little states, they form this massive chain. Now, we're going to have to stop for a second. Oh. Alright, nope, dog stopped. Or it hasn't, alrighty. Give me a second. Hi, I'm back. Just lost my shit at that dog. I had to take a break so it would calm down. Oh, animals. Now, the Eurasian plain is kind of an area where borders constantly change. I mean, France's borders were in flux throughout most of its history, whereas if you look at England, once it formed the foundations of that nation, once it secured hegemony within its region, within its kind of, I guess you'd call it its own little Eurasian plain, its own little plain area where there were no geographical features for defense, it became the hegemon of the region, and it basically secured its borders, because what's Britain's best defense? It's the sea, and they became masters of the sea, not because the British people had an innate thing within their genetics that allowed them to essentially see and feel the majesty of the sea. No, Britannia rules the waves because she's got a long coastline, because defense is important, and the best way to defend an island nation is to have a strong navy. And she expanded because she didn't have all the resources in the world and she needed money. And you find that with a lot of island nations is they tend to have very strong navies. They tend to have this kind of seafaring culture, and they tend to have a desire to expand, which most nations do, because people like more wealth, and it is a historical thing. But the Empire of Persia or Iran today, its borders haven't really changed all that much for a few hundred years. And partly that's because it's quite difficult to conquer mountains, and partly it's because it's quite difficult to conquer past mountains. It takes a lot of force and energy and territory, and also a weak enemy that's fragmented, to be able to do that. And I'm always fascinated by nations that have stood the test of time for one reason or another. And this rule, by the way, is not absolute. So, for instance, the Spanish Peninsula, there is Portugal. Of course, it should be known that for 100 years or so, Portugal was part of Spain under a personal union, which also is how Spain gained control of the eastern half of its country, which used to be under the Kingdom of Aragon. And it's interesting that Spain was once this fragmented kind of mini-kingdom area, and it slowly over time still did that. It still merged into this kind of uniform hegemon. And the only real reason Portugal was able to kind of maintain its independence was the fact that it was culturally similar enough for the Spanish not to feel afraid of, and also it was allied quite closely to a foreign power or another, specifically England and later on Spain as well. Also, you'll notice it's still got that mountain region in the north and south at a very limited entryway, so it allows some form of defense. So it's in these things, it's less about being absolutely able to defend and just more being about a big enough pain in the ass to invade that it's not worth your time. For instance, the country I'm invading now, Morocco, is a good example. it was fairly easy for the colonial powers to invade the coastline, but actually penetrating into the mountainous territory, which is something this game doesn't really model all that well, was incredibly difficult. Getting past the high Atlas Mountains was cripplingly hard, and what's more, it was very expensive, because supply lines through a mountain is just inviting people to attack you. That's actually something people don't know about Switzerland's defense. The Swiss, when Germany was thinking to attack, their plan wasn't to hold them against the mountains. No, their plan was to let the Germans come right in, to blow all their supply lines, let the Germans roll in, and then crush them from the inside, because conquering a mountainous area, while difficult, is not impossible. The real hard part comes in keeping it. Because in a mountain, all your supply chains are stretched through very specific choke points. And moreover, everyone can just retreat into the mountains, and it's very hard to find people in those kind of environments. It's very hard to hunt down millions and millions of people in a mountainous region with tight supply lines, because all you need do is let half of them come in, then get a small group to attack, hold the choke point, and then crush it. The half that's in the mountain chain. And in that way, you can just bleed an enemy dry. You can crush them utterly with much less strength, with much less power. And this is something this game doesn't really model that well, because it's designed to model trench warfare rather than mountain fighting, which is a bit heartbreaking. It's something the modeling this game I don't like particularly well. This is also something I like about this game, is its political system, because parties, you can't really dictate politics. You can't say, all right, everyone's liberal now, we're just going to push through a liberal policy. No, if you do that, you're going to make your people very unhappy. And moreover, this because you're kind of like herding cats in this way. Again, it's the eternal politics. And I love that it simulates the pain of politics, in that a lot of the time, if you want to get something done in this game politically, you have to make them very angry, very upset, so that everyone who is your rivals, who would not normally side with you, agrees to do what you do, agrees to go along with you, because they're fearful of an uprising. And I absolutely love it, the way it models that, in that you can't just go, you know what, today I feel like just controlling everything, so you're going to do what I say. This is a dictatorship now. Because even in a dictatorship, if you don't keep the elites happy at the very least, then you will have uprisings, you will have armies. And it's really interesting the way that happens throughout history. Is a lot of the diplomatic moves nations make are more or less just for internal reasons. Because if they could, most rulers would prefer to just control their nation and build up that wealth and power and then attack. But a lot of national moves come from the fact that the local populace needs an enemy, or they are so driven and emotionally driven to push the politicians to do that they must. And it's really interesting in that way that throughout history, a lot of decisions we consider silly or stupid, or just why would you do that, came not because they thought it was a good decision, but because they needed to keep power. And to keep power, they needed an enemy, or they needed to keep their population happy, or they needed to kind of expand the great glorious empire. And if the empire is not expanding, then that means it's not glorious. Which is something you find in crumbling empires as well, is they'll start to crumble, but they won't adopt policies that will stop the crumbling, because it justifies the fact that they're crumbling. And a lot of early empires were built upon the idea that they could expand because they were righteous, and because they were righteous, they should own the world. And so, in that way, it kind of goes forth. There's actually a great book for that oh, what's it called? My God, Sapiens. Sapiens by Yuval. Oh, my lord, by Yuval. Someone. It's a Jewish man, and he lays out history rather than a group of nations warring. Instead, it's an evolution of ideas and concepts, and the nations which embody those ideas and concepts succeed, and the ones that don't. So his main idea for Europe succeeding in this period in particular was that they, in a way, lost their arrogance and looked outwards. So when Europeans would enter a region, they would look at all the people there. They would take surveys, they would study them. They wouldn't just attack straight away. They'd figure out what they were, what their weaknesses were. And you may think, well, that's obvious, but in those days, empires expanded because they thought they knew everything. Whereas it's quite a revelatory idea to think that you don't know everything, that you're not the almighty being. There's that famous phrase about Socrates, which is, and the oracle said, I was the wisest of all Greeks, for I of all Greeks knew that I knew nothing. And it's an inflammatory and self-serving phrase, but that idea that, hey, I don't know everything, maybe I should learn something, it's quite a powerful idea, and it allows people to expand. Now, this has kind of just been a solitary babble, but I will stop now. I hope you have a nice day, and I hope you enjoyed some random person babbling on about politics.